The stereotype that Russia was the second strongest army in the world was shattered in early 2022 on February 24th, when Putin's army launched a full-scale war in Ukraine. While Russia kept the West in fear of its army, Ukraine proved that Putin's army was not as strong as they said it was. Lack of training, systemic corruption, and completely outdated military doctrine play a very important role in the failure of the Russian army in Ukraine. But there is another factor that many people overlook, and it is no less important. The Russian government has deliberately kept its army weak all this time, even if you find it hard to believe. It is true. Contrary to the stories that many in the West believe about the revered and feared Red Army, the truth is that the Russian armed forces have been deliberately kept in a miserable state from 1917 to the present day. In Russia, the military is not respected and is at the bottom of the social hierarchy. To understand what I'm talking about, watch this video from a Russian state TV channel. A military officer asks for a minute of silence for the Russian soldiers who died trying to seize Ukrainian territory, and look how the host reacts.
Нет, я не хочу это слышать, подождите, нет, стойте! Они гибнут все равно, стойте! Они все равно гибнут. Остановитесь! Подождите секунду! Вы не можете остановиться?
Does he disrespect the military of his country who went to kill and seize Ukrainian territory? In Russia, the military is not respected in any way, and if this is how they treat officers, imagine how they treat soldiers who are on the lower levels of the military hierarchy. They treat them like a piece of shit. The soldiers know that for the elites who send them to the front, they are just cannon fodder, sent to die for the sake of the ambitions of the Russian president, Putin, and the entire Kremlin command. Dozens of videos have flooded social media with complaints from Russian soldiers about the terrible conditions they are facing during the occupation war in Ukraine. Watch these videos that show how Russian soldiers live in military barracks. Not only is there dirt and disorder in these places, but also soldiers who are completely drunk, without discipline and motivation to go to war. This is what is most striking. They complain that they are given absolutely rusty and unusable weapons, and this is when they are lucky to get any weapons at all. Because in another video, they complain that they were not even given anything, and many times they are sent to the front line without any training, as they condemn in this video.
423-й Ямпольский полк, 4-й гвардейской танковой дивизии Кантемировской.
Стоим на передке, все наше обеспечение, патронов нет, гранат толком нет, жрачки нет, воды нет. Вот, ребята, говорите, сейчас это все потом... Воду принесли.
Командир 5-й мотострелковой роты Ямпольского гвардейского полка. Значит, вот как мы здесь. Вот здесь передок. Нас здесь без обучения, без всего отправили сюда. Везде нас из Кантемировской дивизии постоянно. Никакого ни обучения, ни снабжения нет. Люди приехали в своей форме. Покупали все за свои деньги. Чеки остались, жили в сырых палатках, под дождем, на улице.
For a Russian soldier, it is better to surrender to the Ukrainian military and save his life than to participate in a war of aggression that makes absolutely no sense. For the Russian elite, their soldiers are absolutely disposable. But this is nothing new, as contempt for the military has always been present in Russia. Stories of army units being harassed by local mafias and gangs are very common. It would seem that a military unit with enormous military strength, weapons and ammunition would never surrender to local criminals. However, in Russia, this happens regularly because bureaucracy prevents them from using ammunition and weapons indiscriminately. It turns out that the best alternative is to simply pay bribes to local mafia leaders to avoid being attacked. Hazing is widespread in the Russian army. It encompasses a variety of humiliating acts committed by lower ranks, including brutal physical and psychological and even sexual violence, and often ends in death. This is an extremely cruel form of intimidation and even torture, which is a major source of low morale among the lower ranks of the army. And we are not talking about isolated cases, but about a perverse system of torture and humiliation when many young people die or commit suicide every year because of hazing. The New York Times reported that in 2006, at least 292 Russian soldiers were killed by hazing, although the Russian army admits only that 16 soldiers were directly killed by it, while the rest committed suicide. As incredible as it may seem to someone outside the system, it is all part of a plan. But why would someone develop a deliberate plan to demoralize the military? To understand this, we need to understand a little bit of Russian history. When the Bolshevik Revolution seized power in Russia, the revolutionaries considered themselves to be the French revolutionaries of the 18th century or the English revolutionaries of the 17th century. They knew that both revolutions ended with the military seizing power again. Oliver Cromwell in England and Napoleon Bonaparte in France. This makes sense, because in order to maintain power, violence must be used, and no one is more skilled, experienced, and effective at it than the military. When a power vacuum is created, when the ruling order is swept away by revolution, at some point some military tries to fill this power vacuum, and they have everything they need to do so. The Russian revolutionaries made this connection, and soon there were several deaths of military commanders who had distinguished themselves in the Red Army at the time. Officially, they died from enemy fire, but in reality they were killed by their own elite. Stalin's purges also eliminated a large number of soldiers from the Red Army, where many died and thousands were sent to Gulag concentration camps. In addition, Stalin included party commissars in every army command. Thus, every regiment or military command, in addition to the military structure, had party agents to control the army command. With suspicions of internal betrayal and concerns about the power of the military, the state's internal security evolved significantly under the communists. This led to the creation of the KGB, the Committee for State Security, from which Putin himself comes. Its function was not only internal security, intelligence, and secret service, but more importantly, it was responsible for controlling the armed forces. Of course, the Communist Party and its bureaucracy were the main force in the state, which sought to dominate the other two, the army and the KGB. And this was the problem with these three bodies in Russia. The armed forces had the ability to use violence, but they were infiltrated by KGB agents who spied on them. The KGB had much less ability to use force, although it was better paid and had a higher status. Thanks to money and status, the Communist Party could control the KGB and thus the armed forces. However, this system of power was in place until 1991, when the collapse of the Soviet Union seemed like an uncontrollable collapse, but it was not. It was a revolution carefully planned from within the KGB. However, the economic devastation was so great that the KGB was at a disadvantage. Salaries continued to be paid, but inflation was so high that even in the highest echelons of the KGB, these salaries could not buy anything. At that time, the military was in a better position. Thanks to corruption, they could continue to sell weapons abroad and support themselves. When Boris Yeltsin came to power in 1991, he was on the verge of a military coup. And just like the Bolshevik revolutionaries in 1917, he realized that he needed to take power back from the armed forces. This began with several suspicious deaths of generals, a practice that has been continued unabated by various governments since then and until today. Interestingly, after the war, many Russian generals died very suspiciously. In 1999 to 2000, during the Second War in Chechnya, which the Russians themselves started and then won, many generals died shortly afterwards. A period of calm without suspicious deaths lasted until the war in Georgia in 2008, after which a long list of generals died under suspicious circumstances. In 2014, when Russia decided to invade Crimea, the same pattern repeated itself. With each victory in the war, the morale of the military grows. However, an armed force with soldiers with high morale and respected generals who have earned their respect on the battlefield can be a real threat to the government. The intelligence services solved this problem by removing the most respected generals and restoring the old order that had existed since the communist era. As a second measure, the Kremlin is actively promoting FSB agents, young people with no military experience, to senior positions in the army. Finally, there is a third level of this perverse mechanism, which is extreme anti-intellectualism. Not only are young and inexperienced intelligence agents promoted, but those who are promoted in the army are the most brutal, corrupt, and incapable of military service. This is no accident. It is a deliberate policy of minimizing internal threats. Thus, the Kremlin's goal is not to maximize the capabilities of its armed forces, but to minimize the threat they pose to its power. As dictator Putin has remained president of the Russian Federation for more than 20 years, he is increasingly afraid for his power and the consequences that would be brought to bear on him if he left office. It is not surprising that the Russian army is achieving far less in Ukraine than military analysts around the world expected at the beginning of this war. The Russian state's deliberate efforts to keep the armed forces in a state of deprivation and lack of initiative, combined with systemic corruption, have led the Russian army to complete failure. The Russian elite, namely Putin and his friends, know that if the armed forces want to stage a coup and remove him from power, they can do it, and Putin does not need to. They are using all possible resources to control this threat, even if it means destroying their own army. Thank you, friends. That's all for today. Subscribe to the channel. Glory to the soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine.